Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to start by thanking the Prime Minister for our phone conversation in advance of the bombing raids on Friday night and for an advance copy of her statement today. I also join her in paying tribute to Sergeant Matt Tunrow, the SAS sniper from Manchester who was killed on the 28th of March with US forces in northern Syria, and Master Sergeant Jonathan Dunbar from Texas, who was killed in the same attack. I welcome the fact that all British military personnel involved have returned home safely from this mission. The attack in Douma was an horrific attack on civilians using chemical weapons, part of a civil war that has killed hundreds of thousands of people. Mr. Speaker, this statement serves as a reminder that the Prime Minister is accountable to this Parliament, not to the whims of the US President. We clearly need a War Powers Act in this country to transform a now broken convention into a legal obligation. Her predecessor came to this House to seek authority for military action in Libya and in Syria in 2015, and the House had a vote over Iraq in 2003. There is no more serious issue than the life and death matters of military action. It is right that Parliament has the power to support or stop the government from taking planned military action. And, Mr. Speaker, the BBC reports that the Prime Minister argued for the bombing to be brought forward to avoid parliamentary scrutiny. Will she today confirm or deny those reports? I believe, Mr. Speaker, the action was legally questionable. And on Saturday... Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe that the action was legally questionable, and on Saturday the United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said as much, reiterating that all countries must act in line with the United Nations Charter, which states action must be in self-defence or be authorised by the United Nations Security Council. The Prime Minister has assured us that the Attorney-General had given clear legal advice approving the action. I hope the Prime Minister will now publish this advice in full today. The summary note references the disputed humanitarian intervention doctrine, but even against this, the government fails its own tests. The overwhelming humanitarian catastrophe due to the civil war in Syria is absolutely indisputable. But the Foreign Secretary said yesterday these strikes would have no bearing on the civil war. And the Prime Minister has reiterated that today by saying this is not what these military strikes were about. And, Mr. Speaker, does, for example, the humanitarian crisis in Yemen entitle other countries to arrogate to themselves the right to bomb Saudi airfields or their positions in Yemen, especially given their use of banned cluster bombs and white phosphorus? Mr. Speaker, 3 United Nations agencies said in January that Yemen was the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. So will the Prime Minister today commit to ending support to the Saudi bombing campaign and arms sales to Saudi Arabia? On the mission itself, what assessment has the government made of the impact of bombing related military facilities where the regime is assessed to store chemical weapons? What impact on the local people of chemicals being released into the local environment? News footage shows both journalists and local people in the rubble without any protective clothing. Why does the Prime Minister believe these missile strikes will deter future chemical attacks? As the Prime Minister will be aware, there were US strikes in 2017 in the wake of the use of chemical weapons in Khan Shaykhun, for which the UN OPCW team held the Assad regime to be responsible. In relation to the airstrikes against Bazai and Himshinsar facilities, the Prime Minister will be aware that the OPCW carried out inspections on both those facilities in 2017 and concluded, I quote, that the inspection team did not observe any activities inconsistent with obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention. Can the Prime Minister advise the House? Does she believe the OPCW were wrong in that assessment, or does she have separate intelligence that the nature of those activities has changed within the last 5 months? And in the light of the Chilcot inquiry, does she agree with a key recommendation about the importance of strengthening the checks and assessment on intelligence information when it is used to make the case for government policies? Given that neither the UN nor the OPCW has yet investigated the Duma attack, it is clear that diplomatic and non-military means have not been fully exhausted. While much suspicion rightly points to the Assad government, chemical weapons have been used by other groups in the conflict. For example, Jaish al-Islam, which was reported to have used gas in Aleppo in 2016, amongst other groups. It is now vitally important that the OPCW inspectors who arrived in Damascus on Saturday are allowed to do their work and publish their report into their findings and report to the United Nations Security Council. They must be allowed to complete their inspections without hindrance. And I hope the UK will put all diplomatic pressure on Russia and Syria and other influential states to ensure they're able to access the site in Duma. The bigger question must be that during the Syrian conflict, over 400,000 Syrians are estimated to have died in the conflict, and the vast majority by conventional weapons, as the Prime Minister indicated. The UN estimates that 13.5 million Syrians are in need of humanitarian assistance, and there are over 5 million refugees. It's more important than ever that we take concrete steps to halt and finally end the suffering. Acting through the UN, the Prime Minister should now take a diplomatic lead to negotiate a pause in this abhorrent conflict. This means engaging with all parties that are involved in the conflict, including Iran, Israel, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Turkey and the US, to ensure there is an immediate ceasefire. We have, Mr. Speaker, the grotesque spectacle of a wider geopolitical battle being waged by proxy, with the Syrian people used as pawns by all sides. Our first priority must be the safety and security of the Syrian people, which is best served by de-escalating this conflict so that aid can get in. So will the Prime Minister now embark, as I hope she will, on a renewed diplomatic effort to try to bring an end to this conflict, as she indicated in the latter part of her statement? The Prime Minister states that diplomatic processes did not work. This is not exactly true. The initiative negotiated by John Kerry and Sergei Lavrov led to the destruction of 600 tons of chemical weapons overseen by the OPCW. No one, Mr. Speaker, disputes that such diplomatic processes are difficult and imperfect, but that should not stop us from continuing diplomatic efforts. The refugee crisis places a responsibility on all countries. Hundreds of unaccompanied children remain in Europe, and the UK has yet to take even the small numbers it was committed to through the Dubs Amendment. I hope that today the government will now increase its commitment to take additional Syrian refugees. Will the Prime Minister make that commitment today?